Okay, and now we're going to pass it over to our wonderful facilitator, Shin.
Thanks, Miley. Thanks, Reggie. All right, y'all. It's really great to be here with everybody today. My name is Shin. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in the Bronx on Muncie Lenape lands. And as Miley indicated, our agenda for today is going to be a little bit of presentation time from me, maybe about 35 minutes, but I really want to be able to have the time with y'all to ask questions that are most relevant to your work currently. So please feel free if you want during my presentation part to drop something in the chat. Reggie and I will be taking a look and we'll do our best to bundle. And if something comes up that warrants an immediate response, I'm more than happy to do that. All right, y'all. So I'm going to shift over to my next slide here. Whenever I do a training or a conversation about fundraising, honestly, I like to contextualize it with what I personally mean when I talk about mobilizing resources or moving money to community. This quote from Susan Raffo, I'm going to go ahead and read it. There are enough resources to support our collective basic needs. There are restrictions in those resources that are set up by unfinished histories, by the policy of extraction for profit, a form of capitalism, that defined the US as a corporate state from the beginning, one aspect of its original wound. Fundraising, when it is in right relationship, works to release or move around some of those restrictions. I use this quote because it acknowledges to a certain extent how, when we're doing this work, we are constantly presented with very impossible choices within the construct of racial capitalism. After this webinar, I'll also share out a link around the full blog piece, but it contextualizes how we move within our roles, moving resources. Additionally, I think what I particularly love about this last part of the quote is its acknowledgement that when we're talking about release or moving around some of these restrictions, we're still part of the system that the nonprofit industrial complex exists within. So my philosophies around this tend to be one when I'm talking about fundraising, like I really truly mean it of like we need to take care of ourselves. This was never built and meant for us. And we have to constantly confront how we move and build relationships and make choices that are frequently very, very difficult. And especially, I know we all know what this hellhole of a year is already looking and feeling like. So, a little bit about me, so that you also know my background as I'm head into the substance of the conversation. I actually got my career start in grant making. I started off at a private foundation, making grants in a global public health program, and growing up working class with some upward economic mobility toward middle class by the time I went to college. Um, it was my first time contending with like massive amounts of wealth and being chiefly responsible for distributing that wealth. And predominantly at a very white institution, a very white foundation, where most of our grantees were from the global majority. I then shifted over from that very specific type of grant making experience over to rapid response grant making for a feminist fund, also in a predominantly global context. And at that fund, we were an intermediary. So for the first time in my life, I was interacting with development people and found that sometimes development folks can have a very disproportionate amount of power around the conversations with programmatic strategy, future visioning, like what kind of funds we say yes to and how that informs the work, right? So the conversations I was engaging in were around mission drift and things like that. And so, with that exposure to fundraising and development work in a more classic sense, I decided I wanted to have a seat at the table and talking about saying or interrogating our relationships to money, saying yes or no to money, And so for the last 10 or so years, I've done frontline direct fundraising at a variety of social justice organizations, ranging from orgs that advance LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, harm reduction, and workers' rights. So moving on to the next slide. My experiences in these more classic development models is one where I've moved from being the development associate on a team to managing individual giving to doing a lot of institutional fundraising and grant writing to more recently strategic development executive roles. And I put this slide up because I know, and I'm very grateful for NQAPIA inviting me to be a part of this series. I know the last training that Sherry from Emergent Fund hosted um, in September was focused predominantly on grant writing, and there was a lot of really great context and content around different sources of revenue. So I'm not going to spend as much time on that today, but I just wanted to acknowledge that today's training is one where I'm fully aware there are different forms of revenue generation that I won't necessarily be touching on today, such as in-kind donations, fee for service, mutual aid even. But I do strongly recommend Sherry's training in terms of getting a recording and reviewing that as well. Additionally, I also want to acknowledge, and I know there were some really thoughtful questions in the registration process where folks asked about tools and resources for organizing work or work that may not necessarily exist within a 501(c)(3) or fiscal sponsee sponsorship model. Most of this can be transferable, but just a little bit of acknowledgement. My expertise is kind of limited to moving within registered 501(c)(3s and fiscal sponsee, as a fiscal sponsee as well. But I do hope that for today's conversation, there will be something fruitful, as small or as large as it may be for everybody, in that at its core, I do believe that fundraising is about relationship building. And so for today, I'm not going to spend as much time on the government pieces, the foundation pieces, or the corporate pieces. Most of it will be about individual donors and how do you engage and bring folks into your network and how do you engage folks in making a contribution. But recognizing that all of these giving mechanisms require some kind of relationship building, right? So in government, foundation, and corporate models, I know a lot of that can be driven by the quote unquote donor, right? The government issues the RFP. The foundation usually has a super opaque way of being like, invite only, y'all. And then corporate gifts, you got to have a big event, you got to secure those sponsorships. But I also think there's a certain amount of freedom to explore when you're thinking about intentionally building out or building upon an existing individual giving model. All right. So acknowledging that, what are the ways we can fundraise beyond a grant? First is events. And I know probably for a lot of you, when I say events, the first thing that comes to mind is the gala. Looking at some of the comments, and I'm sure we'll hear a bit more in the Q&A part, I recognize that for a lot of groups here, y'all have limited development capacity. And so there's just a blanket acknowledgement that galas are an incredible amount of work. They require months of planning. They can be really costly in some senses. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about other models. So for instance, community dinners can be really excellent events that are a little bit lower lift, a bit more intimate, house parties, drag brunches, dance parties. I recently joined the board of an organization that has a history of doing karaoke battles. So also thinking about how do we curate events that allow us to center our communities, center our history, center our approach to our work, right? What is important about thinking through events is I am a believer in goal setting. And I know sometimes it can feel hard to be like, well, we don't necessarily know how much we want to set our goal as? Is it too ambitious? But knowing that what you're ultimately trying to do is build off of practices that you can shift from year to year and like make small adjustments. And then over time, you'll be bringing in more donors, knowing that relationship building also takes time. Setting goals will allow you to have benchmarks in comparing how you did from one year to the next, especially if you have an event that you want to be able to replicate. Um, and so we'll talk a bit more on the next slide about how to also pick the strategies that most align with the goals that you set. But setting a financial goal is one that will allow you to force some conversations about how do we also make sure that we have the systems to measure this? What is worth measuring? Where do we want to put in our labor and our energy around which staff are holding which relationships? And it starts off at, I think, the early stages. When I talk about peer-to-peer approaches or peer-to-peer fundraising, one particular model that I think most of us think about is online giving these days. So if your organization has the systems and the capacity to build out individual donor pages for folks to have their individual campaign around maybe a birthday, if you have board members that are particularly excited about meeting their give get if you have one, right? Having different online giving options can allow folks to personalize and also speak to why they're particularly committed to supporting your organization's work. And it can ripple effect out. Additionally, peer-to-peer that also balances a bit of an events approach. There are now, I think, there's a resurgence, especially as we've moved further from 2020 of events where folks can do bikeathons or marathons and do fundraising through models of community and building and events, right? So I admittedly am of mixed feelings about like the amount of work it takes. I think anybody here that's ever done like marathon type fundraiser event knows that it takes a lot to support the runners through the process. But it could actually be a really great way to generate some new connections and some new networks and to elevate your organization's profile. And then I also encourage folks to think about peer-to-peer approaches that can be attached to or built upon existing fundraising efforts. So one is most organizations may have some form of a year-end appeal. So whether it be a physical mailing or you may send out a few emails and ask folks to give before December 31st. One model that I've utilized that's been really fruitful in like splitting up the sheer amount of labor a year-end appeal can take is to secure and identify a circle of champions. And you can call them, whatever you would like in terms of bringing them into the fold of folks that maybe have consistently given at a set amount over the last few years. This could be board members, this could be folks that are connected to staff, and bringing in a small group of volunteer solicitors, volunteer champions that would be able to get assigned a list of prospects or a list of donors that need touch points. This will make it a little bit easier on y'all, especially if you have limited staffing, in terms of not having to have your ED do all of the personalized emails, right? And so there's some ways in which you can play with the idea of peer-to-peer within an existing fundraising effort. I also saw a really great question in the registration about how to leverage giving circles. In full transparency, in my personal life outside of my job, I am a member of a giving circle here in New York City, and it has really given me a lot of exposure because of the focus of our giving circle. It's given me a lot of exposure to local groups and local work that I would just never have known about, even as a longtime resident in New York City. And so after this webinar, I'll also share some resources around how to find and identify local or community-based giving circles. There are also some giving circles that are affinity group-based for Asian folks, for queer folks, regional. And so I'll share some resources around like getting connected and introducing yourself, letting folks know, especially if you're at a organization that's operating at the local level. Giving circles are a really great way to build further community, especially with folks that may have resources to contribute. Additionally, for giving circles, many now have like your more standard RFP process. My giving circle is fiscally sponsored by a foundation, and so we have our annual process. But what I've also found is that in the process of going through the applications, some projects really resonate with an individual member and will just give directly. So it also just gives them exposure in a way that like even if you don't get the grant necessarily, um, you never know what could come from it, right? And we've also had repeat applicants and folks that have gotten more than one grant from us. Okay. On my next slide. So this is research, cultivate, solicit, steward. There's sometimes some other steps, but this is kind of what in development we would typically call like our standard moves management process. I'm going to talk through each of these and just highlight the importance of like identifying and making choices around your strategies within each of these steps. And we know it's interconnected and ebbs and flows. Um, but when you're managing an individual donor relationship, it's really important to have like the big picture in mind. So at the research level, I do emphasize that it is important to know your donor, to know what your classic like donor profiles may look like groups of donors that tend to maybe be of a similar age group or have a specific connection to the history of the organization. And I say this with a bit of the caveat of I am not bought into like super donor-centric fundraising models. The ones where like you gotta like track every single thing that the donor said in the meeting, like know all the donor's pets' names, like send the donor a birthday card. Like a lot of those things are based off of like catering to wealthy white folks that I don't think we have to replicate in how we do our fundraising. However, at the same time, I also acknowledge that like our donor communities are constantly shifting, right? And so when our donors are from community, I also think it is important that we know about them and know about their motivations. I if you have the capacity to do something like this, one easy way to go about assessing, well, like who are our donors and how can we maybe like utilize and tap existing donors to expand our donor base. Identifying between 5 to 10 donors that have given consistently in some form. It could be someone that gives annually at $100 a year. It could be someone that gives $5 a month, but they've been giving monthly for a couple years now. Figure out a few different types of donors that are seemingly engaged. It could be a donor that, if you have a mailing system, someone that like engages a lot with the content, right? It's reading all the emails. Identify a few of those and then conduct a one-on-one interview where you can reach out and say, hey, I'm not making a fundraising ask, like no pressure there. I'm just wanting to like have a conversation with you around your history with our work, with our organization, what brings you to supporting our work. And in the conversation, ask them about their history. I think sometimes it's really easy to make some assumptions. Um, and one question I also like to ask is, what other groups do you give to? Um, if they're comfortable sharing that, it gives you a sense of where your unique organization and your work, where that power is, right? And where you can lean more into that with future donors, right? And so, in this, and I consider all of this the research process. And in this process, it is going to be really important that you just track your touch points, because doing it will allow you to build out like your measurement models of like when is it appropriate to ask a donor for an increased gift? How do we want to set those how do we want to set things so that it can be as automated as possible? And I do think it's possible to do some of that in a simple spreadsheet. I have a few tools like that I can share with folks after. So shifting then to cultivation, where you've done some research, you have a sense, you have some prospects. Cultivation is the piece that I think really is like the labor and the churning, and like you just gotta kind of gotta grind, right? And so one common approach, especially when I think about, let's say, like some major gifts donors who are like, hey, we really want to get more donors that will give at the $500 level. Once you've identified them, having a top 10 or a top 20 list, but have it on constant rotation where it's a spreadsheet that the people responsible for development are looking at, on a regular basis. And making sure that you're tracking, okay, we're going to have this touch point, they're going to get this email, we're going to have this outreach around setting up a call. They've indicated they're interested potentially in this programmatic aspect. Can we send them some materials? And doing this in a way that is just like front of mind, easy tracking, and also acknowledging sometimes some folks will be not super responsive, right? And determining as a team, determining amongst your colleagues, like, hey, we're gonna set after 3 or 4 touch points, where this is kind of a cold lead. No matter how excited we were about the potential, we're gonna bump them down the list and then move someone back up to the top 10, top 20. You can figure out the cadence for yourself based off of your workload. I would imagine lots of folks here are holding lots of roles. So be gentle with yourselves, right? But you can figure out the cadence of like, do we want to be rotating folks on a monthly or quarterly basis? And again, this will depend on your personal capacity. Um, and this is another way in which you can map the relationship without necessarily being dependent on like a super expensive CRM system. I've lived in a number of them. None of them are that great, but sometimes like a really clean spreadsheet that's just kind of active will allow you to track the movement of this in ways that are also accessible to other members of the team. So also think about who are you sharing this information with, who needs to know. Once a relationship is secured, sometimes we know donors get very attached to a specific individual. And once you have staffing changes and turnover, that's another piece, right? So tracking some institutional historical knowledge of that donor relationship also, I think, alleviates some of the tensions we feel within organizations around like who's chiefly responsible for fundraising. All right. And then for some folks, I know the very dreaded solicitation. Solicitation, I think, is really technically only like 5% of the work in terms of literal, like the ask, right? You just got to sit down, you got to ask, you got to send that email, you got to ask. But I also acknowledge that it can feel like the hardest part of the work, or it can take up the most emotional space, or it can cause the most um, tensions, I think, for a lot of folks, right? And so with this part, I would encourage where you can to continue resourcing yourself, training up on like it's in this field, you're going to get generally 10 no's for every yes. Like it does take a certain type of like practice to know that it's part of the process. But what I do think is important to do is it's an opportunity, and I invite you to also utilize the solicitation process internally within your organization to first, on an individual level, interrogate your relationship to money and power, right? When you're making the ask, what comes up for you, right? I'm not a licensed therapist. I also don't think you need to process all the shit in your job, in the fundraising work, but it comes up, it inevitably comes up. And so it is important to know like how you feel about asking certain high net worth folks for certain amounts of money, right? And practice that, right? And then once you do something. That's a constant, for me, it's a constant interrogation. I've been doing this for a while, and like every time it still comes up, right? But then it's an invitation, I think, for you to also think about what is your teams, like if you have folks dedicated to fundraising, even if they're operations people or your executive director, if you have folks that you know are working together, because fundraising is such a team sport, um, what is your team's relationship to money, right? And then finally, for the leaders, the explicit leaders of your organizations, I do think it's also important to have a stance organizationally around what is your organization's relationship to saying yes or no to certain money and making the ask. And then one thing that I think doesn't get discussed enough when we're talking about solicitation is because we get so many no's, having the conversation after the fact about why someone said no, their rationale, the reasoning, was it strategic alignment? Was it in an individual donor's case, like this year, we're no longer a two-family household with income, right? And like life happens, things shift. And tracking that in a way that acknowledges that these relationships will ebb and flow. And over time, folks may return to the fold, right? And so just acknowledging what you want to continue to hold and what you want to put down and focus on for the year ahead. And finally, after the gift is given, it's hit the bank, you're continuing to do the important work that you're doing, the stewardship piece is one that will continue to constantly bear fruit. So when I'm talking about stewardship, this is where you have the opportunity within your group, within your organization, to make sure you have some solid collateral between programs and ops and comms folks. It may be worth, depending on where you're at in your organization, to create a tangible one pager that has the visuals and the branding of your work, that has photos from the year. And you don't got to update it constantly, but having something where it's like once you engage in the conversation and someone's excited and they're in, sharing that with them in a way that feels proactive. I definitely know, and I don't think this is all donors, but I definitely know that there are high uh, correlations between donors that don't feel engaged and donors that drop off after a period of time, right? And so you have some choices around like, what does our engagement look like, right? Literally assessing internally how often are you going to talk to and communicate with your donors. For some of y'all, maybe the predominant source of funding right now is institutional grants. And with grants, grant reporting is inherently built into that structure, right? You have to report, you have to write written report. Sometimes there's a phone call. But to what extent can you repurpose some of what you've already done and do a light share of highlights with particular individuals that are engaged and maybe giving at a certain level that you've identified as your major gifts donors? I also think this is an opportunity for leadership within the organization, particularly executive directors, to make a firm commitment to like, you have to build this into your time. And I know it can be a lot with juggling everything else, but to the extent you can work with your team to automate messages, keep things simple, copy paste, right? Like rubrics, like anytime folks feel like they're getting an individualized touch point, it can continue the engagement, right? And I know Reggie will talk about this at the end, but next month, as part of this training series, Win will also be hosting a webinar on evaluation, impact, and reporting. So this is definitely connected to that, and he'll have some really excellent tools in thinking about like, how do we literally talk about the impact of our work? And then please don't forget to ask your donors to join your newsletters, to follow you on social media. I think sometimes it's easy to pay a little less attention to the stewarding piece of it, because a lot of work is put into actually securing the first gift. Excuse me. All right, seasonal allergies. All right, this is my last slide, and then I'm gonna stop talking at you all. Um, there were some really great questions in the registration, and I also just want to take this opportunity to remind everybody here that we know how to do this work, right? I think a lot of times fundraising or philanthropy is painted in such a way that is intentionally opaque, and you have to get your CFRE to be a licensed fundraiser. And while there are definitely some benefits to knowing how to navigate the system, I also know for this particular group of folks, for this audience, and for my understanding of what NCAPIA represents, I think it's really important to just say the gentle reminder of like, you know how to do this work. And at its core, I believe fundraising is organizing work. And so I'm just going to tell a couple stories or little snippets about these three themes that came up in some of the registration questions. And I'm sure will come up as we head into our Q&A. So the first is the importance of telling your story. There was a question about how do you navigate tokenism in fundraising work, and in talking about your work in general, especially with donors. Um, I was previously at an organization, a queer rights organization, where I had a supervisor who was a non-Asian person of color. And we once had a donor meeting where they told me that this donor fetishizes Asian people. And I just remember the impact of like how important it was for me for just the acknowledgement of it. And then this supervisor and I subsequently like did some literal shielding around like some physical space, minimizing the interaction, but also recognizing that this is a major donor, right? And so like it's that tension, right? That's why I put that first slide in there of like none of these choices are pure, none of this money is clean. But we also know our communities need this now more, need these resources now more than ever. And I would just say, in telling your story, it's also okay to say no in terms of who you want to be in community with and who you want to tell it to. I do truly believe there is enough money out there. And I know that can feel sometimes really hard when we're up against like budget deficits and the reality of the day to day. But it is really important to recognize that like the donor communities we choose to engage can also evolve with us. So that's connected to this next piece around values alignment, where someone asked, there were a couple thoughtful questions about what are like the ways in which we can frame what we're saying to donors, right? Like, are there things we should avoid or are there things we should say? Additionally, how do we ensure that like we talk about our work with like in an ethical way, and ensuring that like there's also some tensions with like funder alignment. Funders seem to know what they want, right? So how do you balance that? And with this one, and I think this is also because, quite frankly, I cut my teeth in grant making. So I also know like funders ain't shit. Like it's a little bit of like I was in it for a while of acknowledging that like philanthropy for me, and I'm speaking for myself here, is always going to be part of replicating racial capitalism. And so it will always be responsive. And I know there's a lot of models, and I see value in things like trust-based philanthropy approaches, right? And at the same time, I personally feel no matter how many queer folks, how many bodies of color you throw into these institutions, even in leadership, like at its core, where the money comes from, how the money is being hoarded, how it's built off of the labor and the backs of generations of people, right, on this land. Values alignment is one that's like really hard to navigate in any kind, there's no way to navigate it in any kind of pure way. And so these days, especially now that we're deep into 2025, we've known philanthropy has been shifting away from racial justice pretty much after they got, that moment in 20 of the of responding to the racial uprisings, right? We know that philanthropy will continue to do stakeholder meetings with groups, especially grassroots groups on the ground of like what is happening ahead of the election, and then still spend months into 2025 strategic planning and doing stuff that's like just distribute the money now, please, right? And so where I encourage you to do the work is to internally think about ways similar to having the conversations with yourself, with your team, with your organization, um, having the conversation around where we draw certain hard lines, right? So when I was at a workers' rights organization, um, I remember when I interviewed there, my supervisor, the executive director, was very clearly like, we will never take money from the Waltons, right? Never take money from Walmart. And subsequently, after I joined, I found out that we actually took a very large stock gift from Amazon, right? And so we need to talk about that, especially around like this will inform our decision making in the process, right? Like, what is the difference between an Amazon stock gift, Jeff Bezos Foundation money, Jeff Bezos money, and Mackenzie Scott money, right? So having that kind of conversation will allow you to then pick and choose how you want to build around that or how you want to make your choices. And finally, there was a question about collaboration, and I want to acknowledge that the system of fundraising is very much set up for us to like be in the scarcity mindset, for us to fight each other, for us to like do the crab in the bucket. Um, and when I think about collaboration, I think about how can we do it in ways that we have known how to do for generations. We know how to do as part of our culture, right? And I remember at the start of the pandemic in 2020, I was at an immigrant rights organization um, focused on state-based advocacy and legislation and policy change. And I was on the development team and was just submitting grants, right? Rapid response proposals, left and right, because we needed the money like immediately, right? And um, there was one particular funder who called a whole group of their grantees to a space and was like, we're really excited, we're going to launch a new RFP, right? And we get on this call and we're learning about the RFP, learning about the deadline. And this funder goes out of their way to be like, we really would encourage groups to apply together. And I, to this day, still think about it where this person came on camera, came off mute, and just broke down in tears and was like, "Why are you forcing us to do this form of like competition, right? This is not collaboration." And so, with collaboration, I think it is important to remind ourselves that we can do that on our own terms in our own ways, that our communities have always known how to take care of each other. Um, and I'm also here to remind y'all to like take care of yourselves in this work. This year has been incredibly challenging, and the work continues to be really challenging. And moving resources and doing all of this continues to take its toll in its own ways. So I shouldn't end on such a bleak note, but I'm like, oh, I'm grateful. I'm grateful for everything y'all do. Whether it's visible or not, I think the fact that you're here to learn a bit more about ways in which you can bring in more resources and make your work easier and elevate the work of your organization is really important and it's really needed. And so with that, I will pause. I have a slide here with my email and we'll circulate it after. I'm super open to questions, even past the Q&A around, and I know it's very specific to everybody's individual organizations and situations and roles, so I'd love to stay in touch. All right.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Shin. Can we just show some love, whether it's in the chat, emojis? Wonderful. So now we have about 10 minutes or so for y'all to drop in some questions. It looks like we have one as well as some wonderful affirmations in the chat. So Joseph was asking, or I'm sorry, Mata was asking, how can folks identify good groups to collaborate with?
Yeah. Mata, can you, if you don't mind putting in the chat or coming off mute, I'm curious, like, could you say a little bit more about your work? I have some potential examples, but I'd love for it to be more relevant to you.
We'll give Mata just a minute or two to maybe type in the chat box. Echo what Laura said. I just would love for you to just share some jargon. What is give get? I know we have a couple of organizations on here that don't necessarily have 501c3 fiscal status or boards. So can you just define that term for us?
Yes, absolutely. So in a more traditional board 501c3 model, as Miley said, um, a board will have um, certain expectations around a give get, which is to give a certain amount and to get or utilize their networks to secure an amount. So some high net worth donors might just be like, I'm gonna meet my give get of $5,000 with an individual contribution. Others might be like, okay, I um, come from community. I'm not able to make that amount and personally, but I can connect you to a foundation that I've been organizing with, and they've supported my work in my job. And so, if the foundation ends up making a contribution, that can count toward my give get. Um, it is a very, I would say, traditional like board model. Not all organizations have explicit give gets, and it is a choice. So I didn't get into it today, but like everything here is a choice on the part of white supremacy of like the 5% foundation distribution thing. That's a choice, right? So like if you're at a stage in your organization where um you're making a choice around securing a give get, have the conversation around what would this mean? Who would have access to it? Who are we inviting into it? Which board members would require more resources and support, right? And what does that mean around also I've been at organizations, full transparency, where like with the board, you have folks that got their seats on the board because they give money, right? And they give very little else, right? So that's another tension you have to kind of work through. And I've also been on boards where the give get is just we're trying to, oh, and then I'm sure Win will talk about this next month, but also sometimes the institutional donors will also reinforce the model of the give get, right? Can you get 100% board giving, right? So with that, sometimes the give get is just like give at a personally significant contribution, right? And that may not be an explicit monetary value. So there are different ways to play with it within the structure or maybe not adopt it. But it is also a way in which like board members do tend to be your biggest champions because why else would they be, wanting to spend time, right? The 4 or 5 T's, right? Time, talent, treasure, ties, right? On the organization testimony. So, anyway, that is my give get spiel. And then I'm going to read Mata's clarification here. I was just curious to know if there is a strategy to identify groups to collaborate with. For instance, our youth LGBTQ plus mentorship program. Okay, I'm going to answer this in a few different ways, and please feel free in the chat to steer me in one way or another. The first is um, it has changed quite a bit this year because of all of the attacks on nonprofit organizations, especially social and racial justice organizations. But a lot of funders, and this is on the institutional side, a lot of funders will put their grantees on their website, right? And so thinking through like maybe looking through that of like, oh, I'm actually currently receiving funding from this foundation or this institution and looking through who else are they funding, right? Um, Actually, let me take a step back. Before you even do that, like you may already be connected to donors and groups and groups for collaboration. So also just I really can't emphasize enough, like there's not any need for like any forced collaboration. So start there around like who are you already connected to, right? If you're an organization, when I was at the New York Immigration Coalition, we were part of other coalitions, right? Ones that were working on passing the New York State driver's license campaign, ones that were focused on census, right? And so you're naturally, probably in the nature of your work, connected to certain groups. So I would say start there and lean on that as heavily as you can, because organic, genuine connection is one that like a funder can't forcibly replicate, and also you can't forcibly replicate for a funder, right? And so, starting at where you're already connected, and then looking at of your current donors, the ones that are funding your work, are they funding other groups maybe that are youth LGBTQ mentorship programs in a different state? I think like cross-state learning and collaboration can be really cool, especially around like how we're um, utilizing different models to like combat both like policy at both a in both a reactive and a proactive, like a in both a defensive and a what's the word? Like where we're actually like setting the agenda, right? That work still happens at a local level, local and state level. And so that's one potential way. And then I'm gonna let Miley and Reggie do the actual talk, but like NCAPIA is also a great example of like connecting to the national orgs, the regional orgs that you're a part of that can like build the like make the introductions, build the relationships. Ask Reggie like, hey, we're thinking about maybe expanding this beyond the current offering. What do you think about that, right? And so I think there are ways in which when I was at the National Harm Reduction Coalition, we did fundraising campaigns where for Giving Tuesday, we actually did it entirely based off of highlighting trans groups and sex worker groups that would get all of our Giving Tuesday money, right? And so, granted, we're operating at a national level. Um, we're in a different position budgetarily, right? That we're able to do that. But we had the conversations and we're able to center identify groups that historically didn't have as much um, didn't have as much like national awareness and also just didn't have the same resources to leverage a Giving Tuesday campaign. So that's another example. Mata, I hope that gives you something and we can always follow up.
Yeah, definitely. And Capia's available support. There's a couple of ideas in my head for you, Monta, so we'll stay connected. And then let's just answer one last question. Do you have any approaches you've used for connecting with funders who are invite only?
Yes. Can y'all hear the siren in the background?
I
Okay.
cannot.
Great. New York City, y'all. Okay. Daniel, that's a great question. Similar to the knowing who else your donor funds, your funder funds, um, I have literally just asked other grantee partners, hey, who's your contact at this foundation? Would you be willing to make an introduction? Um, and I think that's what I mean of like, we've been doing that collectively, like looking out for each other, like sharing relationships. And I know it's not always as simple as like share your like $1 million funder, but like in the ask of it, like you get to figure out where the relationships are, right? And so one example is to maybe start with the folks that are on your board or are in leadership positions and do some relationship mapping of who do they literally know, and then asking that. Most of the time it's we forget to ask or we're maybe a little hesitant to ask, and it's very valid, but to do some mapping of like, okay, this board member actually knows quite a few foundations. They met at a conference or they met at an event. Like, then figure out who needs to be on it. It's not always the ED, sometimes it's a different type of relationship. And just having that conversation around, hey, would you be willing? Because that's actually where you'll get in on the invite only in the situations where the foundation doesn't have an open RFP. Um, I've also had situations in the past where the executive director of my organization was working with board members to, like, again, a real generosity of spirit, but a board member actually was like, hey, there's a donor at my organization that gives really large individual contributions. Like, our work is related, hence I'm on your board. Let me make an introduction. I'm actually gonna take a step back. I'm just gonna make the introduction. So they were clear about naming what they would do. And I think that's also important is you can ask folks like, can you make an introduction? You don't have to be a part of the follow-up. I just want the chance to have a conversation because we're doing really exciting work next year that we want to be able to highlight. And maybe there's a match with what I've heard about this foundation's direction, right? And in that example, my executive director ended up getting $1 million gift like right afterward, right? So it is possible. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, folks, for your questions, for your engagement. And thank you so much, Shin, for answering all of our questions, for guiding us through a really wonderful breakdown of some different approaches to fundraising as grassroots organizations. I'm going to go ahead and stop my cloud recording, and then Reggie's going to stop the local recording. So I'm going to do that now.